Hello, my name is Sam Feltham. I'm the Director of the Public Health Collaboration and welcome to the PHC Virtual Conference 2020. The coronavirus has changed all of our lives, but where there's an obstacle, there's also an opportunity. And that opportunity comes in the guise of this virtual conference. Earlier this year, we had to postpone our two main events, the annual conference and the Real Food Rocks Festival, until next year. These events allow us to connect, learn and grow, but they also help us raise crucial funds for the PHC to continue. With that in mind, and before we let the next presenter speak, this virtual conference is 100% free for all. But if you find the content valuable today, then please consider donating £2 or whatever you can afford through the Total Giving website via www.phcuk.org/donate. Or if you're in the UK, you can simply text PHC to 70660 to donate £2 directly from your phone. We hope you enjoy the conference from wherever you are in the world, and be sure to get involved in the civil conversation on the comment section here on YouTube or via the hashtag PHCVCon2020 on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Thanks for your support, take care and stay safe.
Hello, my name is Dr. Sarah Hallberg, and I am so very glad to be with you, albeit virtually. And I want to start off by thanking Sam and everyone else involved in this conference and all the work that they had to put into turning this into a virtual experience so that no one missed out. I'm excited to talk to you today about COVID-19 and diabetes. There's so much that could be said about this topic. There are literally hundreds of articles that discuss this, but we are going to try to go through some of the high points relatively quickly today. And so let's go ahead and get started. So what we're going to talk about is, first of all, why does it seem so hard to get a straight story when it comes to some of the information about COVID-19? We're going to talk about diabetes and obesity as risk factors for COVID-19 outcomes. And we're going to talk about how important glycemic control actually is for the prognosis with COVID-19 infection. And then touch just a little bit on what the heck is the story about ACE inhibitors and ARBs in this disease. So first of all, let's talk about evidence and quality of evidence. And here we have an evidence pyramid. And really in medicine, we try to rely on evidence at the top of the pyramid, which is clinical trial evidence, along with systematic reviews and meta-analyses of those clinical trials. When we take a look at the bottom of the pyramid here is where we start talking about cohort studies, case studies, and we try not to rely on those as much to guide our decision making. But we're in the middle of a pandemic, and this came very quickly. And we were all desperate for data to be able to take the best care of our patients possible. And so we were having to rely a lot more on evidence from the bottom of the pyramid, which is something we're not as used to. Now, the longer that this goes on, the more higher quality evidence we are getting. But some of the reasons why it's difficult to get a certain answer is if the lower quality studies have conflicting results, it's really difficult to make an assessment. We're getting more sure about certain things, such as diabetes being a significant risk factor for poor outcomes with COVID, because what we have is, again, beginning to get some systematic reviews and meta-analysis, but also what we find is even for the lower quality studies, there are so many of them at this point, and the results are so consistent that we can feel pretty comfortable when making an assessment about the evidence. Now, let's specifically talk about diabetes as a risk factor for poor outcomes with COVID-19 infection. I'm going to actually start off here with a systematic review and meta-analysis that to me is one of the least convincing of the studies out there. These studies are all from China over the time period here shown, and overall diabetes was the second most common comorbidity. There were 7 studies included in this review, encompassing about 1,500 patients. Now, one thing I really want to draw your attention to, and I'll draw it again in another study, is the diabetes rate in the study population versus China overall. So in these COVID positive patients, diabetes was found in close to 10% of them. And when we take a look at the China population at all, that's pretty close, because overall the diabetes rate in China is about 11%. And what that does is really say, of course, this is one of many studies that say we just don't have evidence that diabetes increases the risk of getting COVID-19. What it does increase the risk of is poor outcomes once patients are infected. So let's take a look at the forest plot here, and we'll take a look specifically at the diabetes. And what we see is overall in the studies, we did cross 1. So again, this, as I said previously, is the least convincing of all of the studies I'm going to show you. So now let's take a look at another study of patients in the United States, specifically in New York City. So a pretty diverse population there. I want to draw your attention right away to the fact that this is a preprint, and that goes once again back to the quality of evidence. Normally we wouldn't be talking about preprint evidence at a conference, but once again here, we are really interested in information as quickly as possible. So what we have is taking a look at the total COVID-19 positive population in a major medical institution, which includes both hospitals and outpatient clinic, versus the patients who were positive, who had more disease, so they needed to be hospitalized. And when we take a look at the total COVID-19 positive population, we find the median age to be reasonably young, 52, half male, diabetes rate 15%, once again, pretty darn consistent with the diabetes rate in New York City and the surrounding area, which is also 15%. So not indicating an increased risk for catching diabetes, or catching COVID because of a diagnosis of diabetes. And the obesity rate around the same, almost 27% in the COVID positive patients, whereas New York City is about 22% overall. But let's take a look at the more severe disease, so the patients who actually needed to be hospitalized. Well, the demographics here are quite different. Median age quite a bit higher at 62. Again, male predominance much greater. Diabetes rate, wow, over double. So again, indicating diabetes is a significant risk factor for poor outcomes or severe COVID-19. Now, obesity rates were also higher, actually approaching 40% in the patients who required hospitalization for COVID-19 infection. Now, let's take a look at this study, which looks at almost 6,500 patients from 30 studies. And again, investigating whether diabetes was associated with more severe disease and increased mortality in COVID patients. And taking a look here at the forest plot on the right, you can see that the answer is yes. not only more likely to die if infected with COVID and having a diagnosis of diabetes, but just more severe disease overall. Now, this study was interesting as it also included a meta-regression. And what we find out here that is interesting is that there was an association of having diabetes and poor outcomes that was impacted by age and hypertension, but not by cardiovascular disease. And it was actually the flip of what would be expected. So diabetes seemed to be presenting or impacting severity as an individual disease. So looking at diabetes in isolation in patients who were younger and did not have hypertension. That makes sense actually when we think about it, because patients who are younger and have diabetes are much more likely to have diabetes alone as their only comorbidity than patients who are older, who are much more likely to have diabetes plus hypertension and possibly a number of other comorbidities as well. So diabetes alone as a risk factor significantly impacted patients who were younger and didn't have hypertension. But once again, when we take a look at overall risk, you were more likely to have significant disease if you had all three: increased age, hypertension, and diabetes. So let's take a look here at comparing a number of studies and disease severity. Who had diabetes? Well, we can see it's the patients who had more severe disease. And it's striking both in the difference itself, but also in the consistency here in a number of trials. Patients with more severe disease were much more likely to have diabetes as an additional comorbidity. And what about patients who died of COVID? Once again, what we see is that the non-survivors were much more likely to have diabetes as a comorbidity, where if you survived COVID-19, again, much less likely that diabetes was complicating the picture. Now, let's take a look at what evidence there is that obesity is a risk factor. Of course, as you all know, very often comes along with diabetes. Let's take a look at a couple different studies from France. Starting off with this single center retrospective cohort study, again at the lower end of the evidence pyramid. And this looked at all patients admitted to the ICU for COVID-19 over the study time period. And the primary outcome was, did they need mechanical ventilation, which of course would indicate more severe disease. Well, there were 124 patients admitted to the ICU over the study time period. And at the time of analysis, 48% of those patients had been discharged, 15% had died, and the rest remained hospitalized, which I accentuate here because obviously that's going to impact the final numbers here. I mean, did those patients in the hospital then require a mechanical mechanical ventilation? Did they die, or were they discharged alive from the hospital? We don't know. And this study compared COVID-19 to a set of controls. And the controls were 306 patients who were admitted to the ICU in the same hospital for severe respiratory disease, but pre-COVID, so over the year 2019. So the median BMI was different between the two groups, but age and gender were not significantly different. Taking a closer look again at the not only median BMI, but breaking it down into BMI categories, what we find is that the COVID patients definitely suffered from obesity at a much higher rate. But even more striking is the amount of severe obesity with patients with a BMI over 35. Those were significantly in greater numbers in the COVID-19 infected patients. Now, let's take a look at the requirement for mechanical ventilation by BMI category. And what we see is that the higher the BMI, the more likely patients were to need mechanical ventilation. And once again, pretty striking at the high end of the BMI level. And what are the chances at specific BMI levels of needing mechanical ventilation? Well, again, these numbers here are striking and very worrisome because patients with a BMI over 35% required mechanical ventilation almost 86% of the time. Now, we're going to take a look at a second study from France, very similar setup to the first study, looking at patients at a single center admitted to the ICU for COVID and their need for mechanical ventilation, even over about the same time period. And what was different here with this study was the community rates of obesity. Because in this study from Lyon, France, the community rate of obesity was only 11%, whereas in the previous study, the community rate was over 28%. And what we find is a difference in the need for mechanical ventilation. So in the first study, the need overall was almost 70%, where here in this study from Lyon, the difference was, or the mechanical ventilation rate need was almost 60%, so a 10% difference. So was it the fact that the community rate of obesity was different? Well, that could be contributing, but other factors are at play, including the fact that we don't know what happened to the patients at the end of the study time period in either study. And also, what was the algorithm at each individual hospital for putting patients on mechanical ventilation? That could have been different as well. But what is consistent here is that that obesity led to a much greater increase of the need for mechanical ventilation. Now let's take a look at obesity as a risk factor again from the study from that same group, hospital system in New York City. So what this took a look at is BMI, but it was separated by age, because what they found is BMI did not have such a big factor in patients who were over the age of 60. We can see these p-values here. But when we take a look at obesity as a risk factor in patients who were younger than 60, wow, that's a pretty big difference. And again, this also makes sense because patients who are older and have obesity are much more likely to have many other comorbidities that will impact the need for ICU admission, indicating more severe disease. Whereas patients who are obese under the age of 60, well, they're much more likely not to have multiple other comorbidities. So when we look at the rates overall, for people in this study with a BMI between 30 and 34, they were 2 times more likely to be admitted to acute care, so in the hospital in general, and 1.8 times more likely to be admitted to critical care if they were under the age of 60. Now, if they had a higher BMI, over 35, they were 2.2 times more likely to be admitted to the hospital in general and 3.6 times more likely to need ICU care. Once again, obesity does definitely appear to be a significant risk factor for more severe COVID disease. Now, let's take a look at the importance of glycemic control. There are actually a number of studies that would indicate that glucose control is really important in outcomes. But I think this study was the best of the ones that exist. It was published in Cell Metabolism very recently. And it was a retrospective, longitudinal, multi-centered study from a cohort of almost 10,000 confirmed COVID cases, including 19 hospitals. And this cartoon abstract really says it all. When glucose was well controlled in patients with pre-existing diabetes, the survival rate was almost 99%. But in patients who had poorly controlled glucose, the death rate was 11%. So that's a 10% difference overall, really significant. And how did they define well-controlled blood glucose? They can define it as a glucose range of 3.9 to 10. For those in the US, that's 70 to 180. And poorly controlled was a glucose above 70. And again, for those in the US, that would be above 180. So in my view, that's actually a pretty loose definition of well-controlled glucose. But despite that, I would say well-controlled glucose needs to be much tighter. Even with these loose definitions, the survival rate is strikingly different for the patients with well-controlled blood glucose. So let's take a look here again at this Kaplan Meier curve. So what we see here again is just the same data, but it's shown in a different way. And clearly there's a difference between well-controlled and poorly controlled glucose when it comes to outcomes. So quickly, I want to touch on the story that we've heard so much about, which is the difference, what is the story with ACE inhibitors and ARBs? You know, yes or no? And I just want to very quickly point out the reason that it's difficult to make a certain conclusion here. And that is that ACEs and ARBs can increase the levels of something called ACE2. And ACE2 is how the COVID virus makes its entry into the body. There are actually other ways that the virus can enter the body, but it appears that ACE2 is the primary means of entry. And what happens then is, okay, if it increases the rate of ACE2, which is how the virus gets into the body, it seems like it would be a bad thing to be on ACE inhibitors and ARBs. But it's not that simple and straightforward, because increased levels of ACE2 actually cause a lot of things to occur that can decrease that cytokine storm we're hearing so much about. So higher levels of ACE are associated with vasodilation, they're anti-apoptosis, anti-fibrosis, anti-proliferation, decreasing hypertension, cardiac fibrosis, thrombosis, and the risk for ARBs. So we've really got pro, con on both sides here, and we're just not certain which one plays a more significant role. Should we or shouldn't we be on ACE inhibitors? Now I'm going to show you a couple of studies that are out here and what the cases are for putting people on ACE inhibitors and why I would say that overall they're not that convincing. So first of all, I just want to point out, and this is from that cell metabolism study, just how important that cytokine or, inflammation gone crazy is to outcomes. And we look here at it when we compare the poorly controlled to the well-controlled glucose. Poorly controlled glucose, we find that there is higher levels of IL-6, C-reactive protein, and LDH. That's over here on the right side of this graph. Once again, all factors involved in that inflammation gone crazy that puts patients at risk for developing ARDS and worse outcomes. Now, going back to those studies I was saying, this first one looks at 400 patients admitted to a hospital in China. 51 of these patients had hypertension, but 9 of those were excluded for being on no blood pressure med. So once again, to make conclusions on a study with such a small n is the first problem. But of the 42 patients then that they included in the analysis, 17 were treated with ACE and ARBs, 25 patients were treated with different blood pressure medications. They had similar baseline characteristics, and blood pressure control in the hospital continued with their current therapy. So what we see here, if we take a look at the pie figure, is, wow, it seems like there's such a big difference, right, in the outcomes between the two groups. But once again, let's remember the total N size. So ACE inhibitor and ARB group, 23% were categorized as severe, none died, whereas 48% were categorized into the severe subgroup and 1 died in the patients who were receiving antihypertension medications that weren't an ACE or an ARB. But this was not significantly different. Once again, going back to the total N size. So I would say that the sorry. Hey, Ollie, stop. Come here. Come here. Come here. Sorry, Sam. I thought I was going to get through the whole thing without having an interruption. See if I can start again. Stop. Good girl. So if we take a look here now at this pie graph here associated with the study, at first glance, it seems like, wow, there's a big difference. And what we see here is that the ACE inhibitor and ARB group, 23% of them were categorized as severe, none died. Whereas in the hypertensive group treated with other medications outside of the ACE inhibitors and ARB, 48% of them were categorized into severe subgroups and 1 patient died. But these were not significantly different. Once again, because of the low N number here overall. So I'm just not sure that I buy the title conclusion from this paper. Once again, really the same thing. Medical records from 3 different hospitals in China were reviewed. 78% of patients with COVID pneumonia and hypertension were included. 40 had mild disease, 38 had severe disease. But once again, no significant difference in disease severity with any hypertension medication in the overall population. Patients over 65, there was a mildly significant decrease in severe disease in patients on ARBs, but not ACE inhibitors. And you can see, again, the p-value here. This is really not convincing either way as well. So we're just left with, again, should we or shouldn't we mess with our ACE inhibitors and ARBs in patients who are currently on them for fear that they would become infected with COVID? The conclusion, no. The do not change. The advantage versus disadvantage is still unclear when it comes to COVID specifically. But the advantage to ACE inhibitors and ARBs in patients with comorbidities, including diabetes and heart disease, are clear. So there is no reason at this point, unless we get additional evidence that points us in a different direction, which seems unlikely at this point, you should keep your patients on their current regimen of ACE inhibitors and ARBs. So now let's go over a quick summary. It is unknown if diabetes or obesity increase the risk of getting COVID-19, but the current evidence says unlikely. Studies are quite consistent that diabetes and obesity increase the risk for poor outcomes with COVID-19. The mechanisms for the increased poor outcomes have yet to be determined, but many theories exist, and it's likely to be multiple factors. Glucose control seems to make a difference, and a substantial difference, actually, in outcomes, which is not really unexpected. Don't change ACE inhibitors or ARB use in your patients due to fears over COVID-19. And I thank you very much for your time and hope this was helpful. Thank you.